Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It's funny, isn't it, how a single sentence, a handful of words uttered by someone you barely know, can just append everything you thought was solid and settled. That's what happened to me, Helen, just last spring. Richard, my husband of 27 years, and we had what I'd always considered a good life. Not perfect, mind you. Whose is? But good. Comfortable. We'd raised 2 wonderful kids, Emily and Mark, who were now off making their own way in the world. Richard was a senior engineer at a manufacturing firm, a job he'd had for nearly 15 years. He's a creature of habit, my Richard. Reliable, steady. Sometimes, I'll admit, maybe a little too predictable. Our house, a cozy 2-story colonial in a quiet Ohio suburb, was filled with the comfortable clutter of shared memories. The evenings usually found us in a familiar rhythm. Dinner, a bit of television, him often fiddling with some project in the garage, me reading or catching up with friends online. It was a life etched in gentle routines, and I, for the most part, found solace in its predictability. The day it all started was a Tuesday, I remember, because Richard always had his team meetings on Tuesdays, and he'd come home a little more wound up than usual. He was grumbling about office politics, some new directive from upper management he thought was foolish. I was half listening, chopping vegetables for a stir-fry, the scent of ginger and garlic already filling the kitchen. And then he'd said, sighing heavily as he loosened his tie, "There's Mark Jenkins. Thinks he knows everything." I nodded, making sympathetic noises. Mark Jenkins was a name I'd heard before, usually accompanied by a frustrated sigh from Richard. Jenkins was younger, ambitious, and, according to Richard, always trying to change things that didn't need changing. I'd never met the man, just painted a vague picture of him in my mind. Sharp suit, slick hair, probably talked too loud. Just another office drone causing my husband a bit of grief. I didn't give him much more thought than that. How could I have known that this Mark Jenkins, or rather, something he said, would soon occupy so much of my headspace? It wasn't Richard who told me what Jenkins had said. Richard, bless his heart, tends to shield me from what he considers unnecessary unpleasantness, especially if it concerns him directly. No, it came from Carol, the wife of Richard's closest work friend, Dave. Carol and I weren't best friends, but we were friendly enough, meeting for coffee every now and then, exchanging Christmas cards. We were at our bi-monthly book club meeting, held that week at Susan's house. The discussion on the latest historical novel had wound down, and we'd moved on to the more interesting part of the evening: coffee, cake, and gossip. Carol leaned in, her voice a little lower than usual, her eyes scanning the room as if to make sure no spies were lurking among the chintz armchairs. "Helen," she began, her brow furrowed with that particular expression people wear when they're about to tell you something they think you ought to know, but aren't sure you want to hear. "Dave told me something." "Well, something Mark Jenkins said about Richard. I don't know if I should even mention it." My heart gave a little squeeze. The kind you get when you're expecting bad news, but you're not sure what kind. "Oh." I tried to sound casual, reaching for my coffee cup. "What about Richard?" Carol fiddled with her napkin. "Well, apparently, after that big client presentation Richard's team did last week, the one Richard was so stressed about, Jenkins was talking to a few of the newer guys in the break room. He didn't know Dave was within earshot." She paused, and I held my breath. He said it was a shame Richard was so set in his ways, and that someone with his experience should be aiming higher, not just coasting towards retirement. And then he added something like, "It's like he's just given up trying to make a real mark anymore." The words hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Coasting. Given up? My Richard? The man who still meticulously planned our summer road trips down to the last gas stop. The man who spent hours in his workshop crafting beautiful wooden toys for our grandkids-to-be, even though Emily and Mark weren't even married yet. The idea was ludicrous. But Carol looked so earnest, so concerned. Dave was pretty upset about it, she continued softly. He said Jenkins has a way of making things sound plausible, even when they're not. You know, that smooth, corporate talk. I managed a weak smile. Well, Jenkins sounds like a piece of work, but inside, a strange unease had begun to curdle. It wasn't just anger at this Jenkins fellow for badmouthing my husband. It was something else, a flicker of doubt. Not doubt in Richard, exactly, but a sudden unwelcome spotlight on our comfortable life. Had we become too comfortable? Had Richard, in his quiet, unassuming way, started to coast? The thought felt like a betrayal, but it was there, a tiny seed planted by a man I'd never met. I told Carol not to worry, that Richard was tough and Jenkins was just an overly ambitious young man. But the words, coasting towards retirement, echoed in my mind all the way home, and they were still there as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Richard breathing softly beside me, oblivious. I felt torn between my fierce loyalty to Richard and this insidious little whisper that asked, what if there's a grain of truth in it? What if Richard wasn't as content as I believed? Or worse, what if he was, and that itself was the problem? The thought left me feeling more unsettled than I'd been in years. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that I couldn't just let this go. The days that followed were different. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Richard still went to work. I still tended to the house and my garden. We still had our comfortable routines. But for me, a subtle filter had been laid over everything. I found myself watching Richard more closely. Was he really just tired after work, or was it a deeper weariness? When he talked about his day, did his usual complaints about office bureaucracy mask a genuine lack of engagement, a resignation I hadn't noticed before? That phrase, coasting towards retirement, kept replaying in my mind like a dissonant chord in an otherwise familiar melody. It was the given up trying to make a real mark part that stung the most, that poked at a tender spot I hadn't even realized was there. Richard had always been proud of his work, of his contributions. He wasn't one for grandstanding, but he took satisfaction in a job well done, in solving complex problems. Had that changed? Or had I just stopped paying close enough attention? The unease Carol's words had sparked grew into a quiet hum beneath the surface of my days. I felt a strange mixture of defensiveness on Richard's behalf and a creeping, uncomfortable curiosity about this Mark Jenkins. What kind of person says something like that about a colleague? Was it malicious, a calculated move to undermine Richard? Or was it, as Carol had hinted, just an observation, however clumsily delivered, from a different generational perspective on career and ambition? I considered talking to Richard about it, of course. Many times I opened my mouth, ready to relay Carol's story, to gauge his reaction. But I always hesitated. He'd been so stressed lately with that new project, and I didn't want to add another burden. And what if he just brushed it off? Or worse, what if it genuinely upset him, confirmed some private fear he hadn't shared with me? The thought of causing him more pain or making him feel I was questioning him made me keep silent. But the silence felt heavy. It felt like I was withholding something, not just from him, but from our relationship. My usual pastimes felt less engaging. The characters in my books seemed trivial, the vibrant colors of my flower beds less joyful. My mind was elsewhere, replaying Jenkins' reported words, dissecting them, trying to understand the intent behind them. I'd even, I'm a little embarrassed to admit, tried to look up Mark Jenkins online. There wasn't much. A sparse LinkedIn profile that confirmed his role at Richard's company, a photo of a man younger than I'd imagined, maybe late 30s, with a confident, almost cocky smile. He didn't look like a monster, just a modern professional. The kind of person who probably used words like synergy and disruption without a hint of irony. Seeing his face, however, didn't help. It just made the source of Richard's supposed critique more concrete, less dismissible as mere office chatter. I found myself wondering about his life, his motivations. Was he truly just ambitious, or was there something more to him? And why, oh why, did I care so much what this stranger thought? It was Richard I was worried about, Richard's happiness, Richard's fulfillment. But this Jenkins fellow had somehow become a key to unlocking a part of that puzzle. I felt an increasing pull, an almost magnetic need to understand the man who had, with a few careless words, managed to disturb the quiet waters of my life so profoundly. This feeling of being torn, of being an unwilling detective in my own marriage, was new and deeply unsettling. I knew I couldn't stay in this state of limbo. I needed to do something, to find some clarity. But what? Confronting Jenkins directly seemed out of the question, too dramatic, too meddling. Asking Richard was still a step I wasn't ready to take. The answer, when it came, was unexpected, arriving through an ordinary company email Richard had left open on his study computer. It was an invitation to a company barbecue, a family-friendly event to celebrate the successful completion of a major project, and listed among the attendees who had RSVP'd, yes, was Mark Jenkins. My heart did a funny little jump. Here was a chance, perhaps, to see the man in person, to observe him, maybe even interact with him in a casual setting. It felt a little like stepping into the lion's den, but the thought of finally putting a real person, not just a LinkedIn photo, to the troubling words was too compelling to ignore. I told Richard I'd love to go. He seemed surprised, but pleased. I just hoped I was doing the right thing. The day of the company barbecue was bright and sunny, one of those perfect late spring Saturdays that make you feel like anything is possible. Richard was in a surprisingly good mood, whistling as he packed a cooler with drinks. He seemed genuinely pleased I was coming along. I hadn't attended one of his work functions in years, usually preferring a quiet weekend at home. But my own mood was a complicated mix of anticipation and trepidation. I'd spent an inordinate amount of time choosing my outfit, wanting to look casual yet put together, approachable but not overly friendly. I felt like a spy on a mission, which was ridiculous, of course. I was just a wife accompanying her husband to a company picnic. The park where the event was held was sprawling and green, already bustling with families. Kids were running around, music was playing, and the smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs filled the air. Richard quickly got absorbed in conversation with some of his colleagues, patting me on the shoulder before he wandered off towards a group gathered around a smoky grill. "Mingle a bit, honey," he'd said. "I'll grab us some food." Left to my own devices, I scanned the crowd, my eyes searching for one particular face. It didn't take long to spot him. Mark Jenkins was standing near a volleyball net, laughing easily with a group of younger employees. He was taller than I'd expected from his photo, dressed in well-fitting jeans and a casual shirt, looking more like someone enjoying a day out with friends than a corporate shark. He had an easy confidence about him, a way of holding himself that drew people in. I watched him for a while, trying to reconcile this image with the man who had, according to Carol, so dismissively critiqued my husband. He didn't look arrogant, exactly, but there was an intensity in his eyes when he spoke, a focused energy that was palpable even from a distance. I took a deep breath and decided that just observing wasn't enough. I needed to understand, even if it was just a little. I walked over to the drinks table, feigning interest in the selection of sodas and iced tea, positioning myself closer to his group. It was a clumsy move, I know, but I wasn't sure what else to do. As luck, or perhaps fate, would have it, Mark Jenkins himself broke away from his group and headed towards the same table, presumably for a refill. He had a friendly smile on his face, a stark contrast to the villain I had half expected. He nodded politely as he reached for a cup. "Enjoying the party?" he asked, his voice pleasant, nothing like the cutting tone I'd imagined. This was my chance, however small. "Yes, it's a lovely day for it," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Helen, by the way, Richard Miller's wife." His eyes lit up with a flicker of something, recognition. "Surprise?" "Oh, Richard's wife. It's great to finally meet you," he said, extending his hand. "Mark Jenkins. I work with Richard quite a bit." His handshake was firm, confident. There was nothing overtly offensive about him, nothing that screamed backstabber. He seemed personable. Even, dare I say it, likable. This was not what I had prepared myself for. "Richard mentions you," I said, trying for a neutral tone. He chuckled, a surprisingly warm sound. "I hope it's not all complaints about the demanding younger generation." He gave a self-deprecating smile. "We do have different approaches sometimes, but I have a huge amount of respect for Richard. His experience is invaluable." This was it, the opening, but the words caught in my throat. How could I bring up something so awkward, so accusatory, at a family barbecue with his friendly gaze on me? Instead, I found myself saying, "He's very dedicated." Mark nodded, his expression turning more serious. "He absolutely is. In fact," he paused, looking around as if to ensure privacy, though we were still in a relatively open space. He leaned in slightly. "Can I be frank, Helen? Since you're Richard's wife, perhaps you'd understand. I sometimes worry that Richard, well, that he doesn't get the recognition he truly deserves around here. He's got so much more to offer." My mind reeled. This was so different from the dismissive, coasting comment Carol had relayed. This sounded like concern, admiration even. Could Carol have misunderstood? Or had Dave misheard? Or was Jenkins just incredibly skilled at saying the right thing to the right person? The discrepancy was jarring. He continued, his voice earnest. "He's a brilliant engineer, one of the best. But the company, well, it sometimes overlooks the quiet contributors, the ones who aren't constantly tooting their own horn." He looked directly at me. "I've actually been trying to find ways to highlight his contributions more, to make sure management sees the full scope of his expertise." I was speechless. This man, the supposed source of my unease, was now painting a picture of himself as Richard's advocate. The ground felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. The subtle tension I'd been carrying for weeks was now amplified by a profound confusion. Was Mark Jenkins a Machiavellian manipulator or a genuinely well-intentioned colleague? And what did this mean for Richard and for my understanding of his life at work? The casual, sunny atmosphere of the barbecue suddenly felt charged with an undercurrent I couldn't decipher. My initial mission to simply observe had morphed into something far more complex. I felt more torn than ever, but now the conflict was not just about what was said, but about who this Mark Jenkins truly was and what his unexpected words really meant. My conversation with Mark Jenkins at the barbecue replayed in my mind for days. His words, so different from what Carol had reported, had thrown me completely off balance. He's got so much more to offer. I've actually been trying to find ways to highlight his contributions. These weren't the phrases of someone who thought Richard was coasting or had given up. It was the complete opposite. Could Carol have gotten it so wrong? Or Dave? It seemed unlikely they would intentionally mislead me. Perhaps the original comment was made, but the context, the nuance, had been lost in translation. Or maybe, and this thought was more unsettling, Jenkins was adept at playing different tunes for different audiences. The confusion was a knot in my stomach. I found myself oscillating between suspicion and a tentative hope that maybe things weren't as I'd feared. Maybe Richard wasn't being subtly undermined at work. Maybe someone actually saw his worth, even if Richard himself was too modest to showcase it. I decided I couldn't let it rest there. The discrepancy was too large, the implications too significant. I needed more information, but I was still hesitant to involve Richard directly. He seemed happier since the barbecue, more relaxed. The project he'd been working on had indeed been a success, and he'd even mentioned, with a touch of surprise, that Mark Jenkins had publicly praised his role in it during a team meeting. Young Jenkins can be a bit much sometimes. Richard had chuckled over dinner one night. But he's sharp. I'll give him that. And he actually had some good things to say about my designs for the new component. Surprised the heck out of me. This only added to my perplexity. Was Jenkins genuinely trying to support Richard? If so, where did that initial negative comment come from? I felt like I was navigating a maze with no map. My opportunity for more clarity came unexpectedly. About a week after the barbecue, I was having coffee with Carol. I'd been debating whether to bring up my encounter with Jenkins, unsure how she'd react. But she brought him up first. "So," she said, stirring her latte with a little too much vigor, "did you happen to see Mark Jenkins at the barbecue? Dave was keeping an eye on him. Still thinks he's a bit of a snake in the grass." I took a careful sip of my own coffee. "Actually, Carol, I spoke to him." Her eyebrows shot up. "You did? What did he say? Was he insufferable?" I hesitated, then decided to be direct. Honestly, he was perfectly pleasant, and he said some very positive things about Richard, about his experience, his contributions. He even said he thought Richard deserved more recognition. Carol stared at me, her spoon clinking against her cup. "Well, I'll be," she said slowly. "That's not what Dave heard him saying that day in the rake room." "Not at all." "Are you sure of what Dave heard?" I asked gently. "I mean, could there have been a misunderstanding?" Carol frowned, thoughtful. Dave was pretty clear. Jenkins was definitely talking about Richard coasting and being set in his ways. He was quite indignant on Richard's behalf. But she paused. Dave also said Jenkins is incredibly ambitious. Maybe he realized badmouthing a senior colleague wasn't a good look, and now he's trying to smooth things over? Or maybe he's playing some kind of political game. Her words brought back a wave of my initial suspicions. The political game angle felt plausible in a corporate environment. But there had been a sincerity in Jenkins's voice when he spoke to me, a genuine earnestness in his eyes. Or was I just being naive, too willing to believe the best because the alternative was so disheartening? I left my coffee with Carol feeling even more conflicted. It seemed there were two Mark Jenkinses, the one who criticized Richard behind his back and the one who praised him to his wife and apparently in team meetings. How could both be true? I realized that to get to the bottom of this, I needed to understand Mark Jenkins himself, his motivations, his perspective. And perhaps, just perhaps, I needed to understand Richard's work life from an angle I'd never considered. The thought of deliberately seeking out Jenkins felt audacious, even a little foolish. What business was it of mine, really? But the desire to unravel this knot, for Richard's sake and for my own peace of mind, was becoming overwhelming. I found myself thinking about what he'd said. "Since you're Richard's wife, perhaps you'd understand." It was as if he'd opened a door, however slightly. The following week, I found myself in downtown Cleveland for an art exhibit I'd wanted to see. Richard's office building was only a few blocks away. On a sudden impulse, one that made my heart beat a little faster, I decided to walk by. It was lunchtime, and people were milling about on the sidewalks. As I approached the sleek, modern skyscraper where Richard worked, I saw a familiar figure emerge from the revolving doors, talking animatedly on his phone. It was Mark Jenkins. He was alone. This was it. A chance encounter, unscripted, away from the forced conviviality of a company picnic. My mind raced. Should I approach him? What would I even say? Before I could overthink it, he ended his call and looked up, his gaze briefly meeting mine. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He smiled. Helen, isn't it? Richard Miller's wife. Fancy meeting you here. It was now or never. Mark, hello, I said, trying to sound casual, as if running into him downtown was the most natural thing in the world. I was just at the art museum. Oh, the Impressionist exhibit. I've been meaning to check that out, he replied easily. An awkward pause hung in the air for a moment. I took a breath. Actually, Mark, I began, my voice a little shaky despite my resolve, I was wondering if I could talk to you for a few minutes. About Richard and what you said at the barbecue. And, well, about some other things I heard. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened with a new attentiveness. He glanced at his watch. I was just about to grab a quick lunch. There's a decent cafe around the corner. Would you care to join me? We could talk there. It was a direct invitation, a willingness to engage that surprised me. Part of me wanted to retreat, to murmur an excuse and walk away. But a stronger part, the part that needed answers, nodded. I'd like that, thank you. As we walked the short distance to the cafe, a quiet, modern place with minimalist decor, I felt a strange sense of unreality. Here I was about to have lunch with my husband's colleague, a man who was either a concerned supporter or a duplicitous schemer, all because of a few unsettling words. The subtle tension I'd been living with for weeks now felt like it was coiled tightly in my chest. When we were seated at a small table by the window, with sandwiches and iced teas ordered, Mark looked at me expectantly. So, Helen, he said, his tone open, inviting. You mentioned some things you heard, and what I said at the barbecue. I get the feeling there's some confusion, and I'd be happy to clear up anything I can. His directness was disarming. I decided to mirror it. Mark, I started, choosing my words carefully. I appreciate your candor at the barbecue. You spoke very highly of Richard. But I'd also heard indirectly that you'd previously made some less positive comments about him, specifically about him coasting and being set in his ways. He didn't flinch. He listened intently, his gaze steady on mine. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Thank you for being straightforward, Helen. I appreciate that. And yes, I can see why that would be confusing and concerning for you. He paused, gathering his thoughts. It's true, he said, his voice lower now, more serious. A while back, in a moment of frustration, I did say something along those lines to a couple of the junior guys. It was after a particularly challenging project meeting where Richard had been, resistant to some new methodologies we were trying to implement. It was poor judgment on my part to voice my frustrations like that, especially where they could be overheard and misinterpreted. And for that, I am genuinely sorry. It wasn't meant as a personal attack on Richard, more a comment on the challenges of change within a large organization, and how established expertise can sometimes become a barrier to innovation if we're not careful. His admission, so direct and unapologetic, caught me off guard. I had expected denial or deflection or some corporate doublespeak. Instead, he owned it. But he continued, leaning forward slightly. his expression earnest. That comment didn't come from a place of disrespect for Richard. Quite the opposite, in fact. It came from a place of believing he's capable of so much more. I see his talent, his incredible depth of knowledge. And yes, sometimes I get frustrated because I feel like the system, the company culture, even his own modesty, holds him back from making the even bigger impact he's capable of. The coasting comment was a clumsy, ill-chosen way of expressing that frustration. It wasn't about him giving up, but about my desire to see him. Unleashed, I suppose. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. When I spoke to you at the barbecue, that was the truth. I do admire Richard. I do think he deserves more recognition, and I have been trying, in my own way, to advocate for him, to ensure his skills are utilized and seen by the higher-ups. Perhaps my methods are sometimes unrefined. I'm still learning the nuances of navigating personalities and politics in a company this size. I sat there, processing his words. It was a lot to take in. His explanation felt plausible. It painted a picture not of malice, but of youthful impatience, ambition, and perhaps a genuine, if awkwardly expressed, concern for Richard's potential. It didn't excuse the original comment, but it reframed it. It made Mark Jenkins a far more complex character than I had imagined. Not a villain, not a hero, but a human being with his own perspectives and flaws. So, the things you said in the break room, I said slowly, it wasn't that you thought Richard was lazy or incompetent. Good heavens, no, Mark said, looking genuinely shocked. Absolutely not. Richard is one of an increasingly rare breed, a truly skilled engineer who understands things from the ground up. My frustration was that I felt he was sometimes content to let his light shine only in his own cubicle, so to speak, when it could be illuminating the whole department, or even the company. I want him to be seen as the leader he naturally is, not just the reliable senior guy. A wave of emotion washed over me. It was relief, partly, that the image of Richard being secretly belittled was perhaps inaccurate. But it was also something else, a dawning understanding of the complexities of Richard's professional world, a world I had only ever glimpsed from the outside, and a surprising, unexpected empathy for Mark Jenkins. He wasn't just a sharp suit or a corporate shark. He was young, driven, and perhaps saw in Richard a potential that even Richard himself, or I, had started to overlook in the comfortable rhythm of our lives. The conversation flowed more easily after that. We talked about the challenges of the industry, the generational differences in work styles, his own career aspirations. He spoke with passion and a surprising degree of insight. I found myself listening, really listening, not as Richard's defensive wife, but as one adult engaging with another. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere between us, a letting down of guards. The tension I'd carried for so long began to ease, replaced by a tentative sense of connection, an understanding that transcended my initial misgivings. This lunch, born out of suspicion and anxiety, was turning into something else entirely, an unexpected moment of clarity, and perhaps the beginning of a very personal discovery. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense that this whole confusing episode might lead to something positive after all. As our lunch with Mark Jenkins drew to a close, I felt a profound shift within me. The man I had mentally cast as a potential antagonist now seemed more like an unlikely catalyst, someone whose actions, however initially unsettling, were prompting a re-evaluation I hadn't realized was needed. He hadn't just offered an explanation. He'd offered a new perspective on Richard, on his work, and even, indirectly, on our life together. "Thank you, Mark," I said, as we waited for the check. "Thank you for being so honest with me. It's given me a lot to think about." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. The pleasure was all mine, Helen. And please, if you ever have any concerns, or if you think I can help Richard in any way, don't hesitate to reach out. Sometimes an outside perspective, even a slightly meddling one like mine," he added with a self-deprecating chuckle, "can be useful." He paid for our lunch, despite my protests, and as we stood outside the cafe, ready to part ways, he paused. "You know, Helen," he said, his tone thoughtful, "Richard is lucky to have someone like you looking out for him, someone who cares enough to seek out answers. Not everyone has that." His words were simple, but they resonated deeply. It was a moment of unexpected connection, a recognition of shared care for Richard, albeit from very different standpoints. It wasn't romantic, not in the slightest, but it was deeply emotional, a sense of two people understanding each other on a level that transcended workplace dynamics or social pleasantries. It was based on mutual respect, a respect that had grown in the space of a single, honest conversation. Walking away from the café, my mind was buzzing. The city streets, which had seemed so ordinary just an hour before, now felt vibrant, alive with new possibilities. Mark's explanation about his comment, his frustration with Richard not aiming higher, not because he was incapable, but because he was ** capable, it was a revelation. It wasn't an insult. It was, in its own clumsy way, a compliment. It suggested that Richard wasn't seen as fading away, but as a valuable asset whose full potential was perhaps being underutilized, or who was too modest to push himself forward. This painted a picture of Richard's work life that was far more nuanced than his usual grumbles about bureaucracy had ever conveyed. I realized how much I had taken Richard's career for granted, how little I truly understood about the daily pressures, the ambitions, the interpersonal dynamics he navigated. I had seen him as steady Richard, the reliable provider, and perhaps, in doing so, I had inadvertently reinforced the very coasting that Jenkins had initially, and I now understood, mistakenly, seemed to accuse him of. The experience left me feeling profoundly changed. The initial feeling of being torn had transformed into a sense of clarity, and with it, a surge of purpose. I no longer felt like a passive observer in Richard's life, or a victim of office gossip. I felt empowered, enlightened. This was my personal discovery, that sometimes the things that shake us out of our comfort zones are not threats, but opportunities for growth, for deeper understanding. That evening, I looked at Richard with new eyes. He was sitting in his armchair, reading the newspaper, the picture of contentment. But now I saw beyond the quiet facade. I saw the brilliant engineer Mark Jenkins had described, the man with so much experience and so much yet to offer. And I felt a renewed sense of love and admiration for him, coupled with a gentle resolve to be a more active partner in encouraging his passions, not just his comfort. I didn't immediately tell Richard about my lunch with Mark. It felt like something I needed to process first, to understand its implications for me, for him, for us. You won't believe what happened. Part of this story isn't some dramatic confrontation or office scandal. It's something quieter, more internal, but no less profound. It's about how a piece of negative gossip led to an unexpected connection with a supposed adversary, and how that connection opened my eyes to the subtle ways we can inadvertently limit ourselves and the people we love by settling into comfortable narratives. What happened was that I started to see my husband and my marriage with a fresh perspective. I realized that my desire for Richard's comfort and contentment might have inadvertently stifled a part of him that still yearned for challenge, for recognition, for making that real Mark Jenkins had spoken of. Over the next few weeks, I began to gently encourage Richard to talk more about his work, not just the frustrations, but the aspects he found engaging, the ideas he had. I listened more actively, asked more questions. I suggested he consider mentoring some of the younger engineers, something he'd briefly mentioned wanting to do years ago, but had never pursued. To my surprise, he was receptive. It was as if a dormant part of him was reawakening. He started talking about a new project initiative with a spark in his eye I hadn't seen in years. He even mentioned, with a wry smile, that Jenkins Fellow had been surprisingly supportive of some of his more innovative ideas. Turns out he's not just a slick talker, Richard admitted one evening. He actually knows his stuff. And he's pushing for some changes that might actually be good. I never told Richard the full story of Carol's warning or the depth of my initial anxieties. Some things, I decided, were best left as my own journey. But I did eventually mention, casually, that I'd run into Mark Jenkins downtown and had a brief, pleasant chat. Richard just nodded, accepting it without much curiosity, already preoccupied with a new design challenge he was sketching out on a notepad. And that was okay. The real change wasn't in some dramatic revelation to Richard, but in me. My interaction with Mark Jenkins, born out of a misunderstanding and a desire to protect my husband, had led to an unexpected alliance of sorts. It had taught me about the importance of seeking understanding before judgment, about the complex humanity that exists even in people we're predisposed to dislike. It taught me that coasting isn't always about a lack of ambition, but sometimes about a lack of opportunity or encouragement. And it taught me that emotional connection and mutual respect can blossom in the most unexpected of places, even between a concerned wife and her husband's ambitious younger colleague. My world didn't dramatically explode, but it subtly, meaningfully expanded. I learned that sometimes what seems like a betrayal or a criticism from the outside can actually be a mirror, reflecting back not just on the person being discussed, but on ourselves and the roles we play in each other's lives. The reflection I saw wasn't entirely comfortable, but it spurred a growth in me, and I believe, a renewed vibrancy in Richard that I wouldn't trade for anything. And that, I think, is something worth sharing.